Jennifer and India's Nature for organizing and inviting and putting so much of background effort into doing all of this. And thanks everybody for joining today. I'm excited to be sharing stories and what do they mean and our connection with nature. And I hope you find it meaningful. And I hope you share also stories by the end of this conversation because I would love to know from your side as well. So let me know if you can see my screen now. Um, is that visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Yes, yes.
Lovely. So, my talk is titled The River Sings, Storytelling Humans and Rest of Nature. And it will kind of revolve around the themes of storytelling, of course, but why have humans always created stories and what does it mean in terms of our sense making of the world, the uh, the spaces we live in and the spaces we acquire, and how do we relate to them. And I would like to do that by telling stories because I think that's what is the idea that we talk about stories, we hear each other, and we listen to the stories and what do they tell. And by the end of it, I will try to weave together what does it mean to share these stories. So yeah, that's what you can expect for next 30-40 minutes. And then I would love to hear from all of you. What does it evoke amongst all of you? Um, but why has storytelling been important? How are stories connected to the world around us? And how can we tell more stories of more than human world? I think that's what one is trying to work through in this conversation. So I'll start with one story about giving a bit of a background about why I titled this presentation "The River Sings." So I was in this remote village called Chumathang in the Trans-Himalayan landscape of India in Ladakh. And I was speaking to these young kids about rights of nature, rights of rivers. And I was asking them, what do they think are the rights of river Indus, the river that they live on the banks of? And they were answering a bit of with lots of curiosity, trying to think about their own rights as kids and also thinking about rights of the river. One They were saying that the river has the right to not be polluted, the river has a right to flow, the river we have the right to fish, and there were a lot of interesting things that they were sharing. And then came a response that left me and some others who were sitting there facilitating this session a bit stunned. A very shy young girl sitting at the back of the this circle said that the river has a right to sing. And another child, piped up and said, the river has a right to play. It plays with stones, with its banks, with its fish. And that really, got us wondering, like, how would one articulate or see river as singing? And who but children, not yet weighed down by conventions of the mainstream education and not yet taught to think only rationally or scientifically, and to be able to really play freely amidst the hills and the fields and around the river. um, those are they will be able to have those observations because they truly embody what is to be living along a river and what it is to know a river from a very different perspective. And I think that has been an inspiration for me, what I heard from this young child, and that's why I wanted to name this presentation and dedicate it to her real true embodiment. And that's why communities across, not just in Ladakh, but across India and in many other parts of the world, have been articulating the existence or the rights of nature in a much more beyond, say, legal or scientific perspective, but really articulating in the way they observe or animate the rest of nature, it having an agency of its own. The river has a right to sing, play, flow, live, and in many different ways, seeing it not really separate from the humans. And in Ladakh, including in many other landscapes, these landscapes are alive in many ways. They have stories, they are animated. For example, in lots of trans-Himalayan communities and in other parts, they believe that all their pasture lands, springs, lands, mountains, snow, animals, all are protected by guardian deities and guardian spirits. And in many ways, they are the custodians of those lands and those regions. And in very beautiful ways, actually, then having a sense of a shared existence and reverence for rest of nature. Now I want to move towards far east in Assam and share a very interesting story from this community called the Dimasas. So Dimasas are indigenous community Adivasis living in Assam in Arbi along districts and Karbi along districts. And Dimasa means children of the big river. And so in their name, in their identity itself, the river is evoked. And the river is the Brahmaputra River. And Dimasas believe that they came from far off lands, as far off as Mongolia, apparently, and came and settled in this region. Among the Dimasas, they believe that the forest or the jungle, which a particular kind of a forest, a very dense forest, is called Hagra, which is the land of the elderly. So, again, in the language itself, the land is given an importance or a space of an elder where you enter that space with reverence. You enter that space with knowing that the land knows more than you can ever know. So that's to just give you a sense of the Dimasas and the kind of worldviews they kind of live with. And all of again, these spaces are animated with stories. And this village that you see a photo from, it is at the confluence. It's called Sampari Disa, and it's at the confluence of two rivers. And we know that always these confluences of rivers are considered very sacred. Lots of sacred groves around these confluences uh, have been the sacred sites for a lot of indigenous communities, and the same is also for the Dimasas. The stories that I want to share is about this lake, um, Hajong story. It's from another village, and again, the Dimasas live in this village, and this is a very interesting lake, which is also biodiverse heritage site, biodiversity heritage site. And it has a very interesting story of how and what came to be this sense of connection with the lake. And so I visited this lake, and I just share my experience and then the story. So when I was around this lake, I really wanted to go and see the turtles. And so the Hajong people believe that the turtles who live inside this lake, some actually very endangered species, are their ancestors. And so I really wanted to go and see what turtles are around. And when I went to the lake, I saw this. I'm sure most of you here would know of Hulok gibbons. So I saw the Hulok gibbon, and it actually resides on a sacred tree that is right across the lake. um, I sat through the morning and I didn't see any turtles. They do exist, but I didn't see any. But I had an eerie feeling all through while I was sitting and moving around this lake, a feeling that I cannot describe as good or bad. It's just a feeling that I had. Anyway, by the evening, I went back and I asked some elders in the village about the story of this lake. And they said that, and there are not one's version of this story. I'll share only two, and then I'll share what it evoked in me as well. So the Dimasa king was called by the villagers for a ceremonial meal, and the king came and was fed, lavishly. And then the food was served in a big leaf, which was thrown after with other leftovers after the king finished having his meal. And in the next day, when they went to clean things up, they found that the leaves, collected leaves, were missing. and it was nowhere to be found, and everyone wondered if we didn't dispose it off, where did it go? So several people gathered to find out in the night who came and did this. And in the middle of the night, in extreme dark, bright light appeared, and in their eyes, as people who were waiting for figuring this out, who took the leaves, and as their eyes adjusted to this bright light, a dragon stood shining bright in front of the young boys. So they immediately tried killing it, but they couldn't, and they started throwing sticks at the dragon. And one young boy pulled out a sword. He hit the dragon with the sword and cut it in half, and one half of the dragon's body disappeared into some forest, and the other half moved the earth in a way that it caused the earthquake, and the village drowned, and everyone in it too. And later, when the village drowned, the king came to look at what has happened. They tried to dug it up, and even after the digging, nobody was found. I mean, they couldn't dig it up, and even the king's son, who was trying to facilitate this digging up, actually passed away. So eventually, the spirit of the lake apparently appeared through a medium and communicated that they now live in this lake, and that the humans who are living around the upper Hajong village will have to, learn from the mistakes of their ancestors, and perform certain ceremonies to appease the spirits of the sacred lake. Now, the researchers and some others who have actually gone and spoken to others have reported an alternative version of this story as well. That Hajong was once a prosperous village. Then they one day, when villagers caught an old python living underground, they killed it for meat, and then the sin of killing the python became a curse, and the village at that night itself sank into the lake. And those who had python's meat became turtles and drowned, except one old virtuous widow who was cautioned in her dream to not eat the python and to leave the village. And she later spread the news to other villages and told the misfortune of Hajong elders. And it is believed that the turtles then that are found in the lake are ancestors of the present day villagers. So now, because of all of this story and extreme sacredness around this lake and the adjoining forest, people have very strict rules of not cutting down the trees, maintaining the habitat, not allowing outsiders to go in without certain smaller ceremonies being performed. So basically, I'm sure all of you know of very strict rules that are followed in sacred sites. They maintain all of that. What this story powerfully tell is the idea of this shared existence, of this reverence. And also, I think for me, what most importantly it meant was about limits to human extraction and limits to humans ability to be everywhere wherever we want to. And I think that's where the clash emerges, and I will reflect on it a little bit more later. The other one, again, I want to share from a Trans Himalayan landscape in Spiti. And this is a story which this elder that you see on the left, Funchok Namgyal, who told me about various things about their emergence and how they came here and all of that, but a very interesting story of their own village, Kibber. So he tells me that about 1,000 years ago, some villagers were desperate for water because it's a very dry region, and there was nothing to be found underground and nothing on the surface. A river flowed in their landscape, apparently Spiti River, but it was too far for the village that was high up in the valley. So some elders made a difficult journey to Tibet to check if with the lamas there as to what can be done. And lamas spoke about listening and heeding to the signs that will direct to the source of water. A raven sat on the spot a bit too long and a little far off from the village. It was a sign the elders reckoned. They started digging and kept digging until they discovered water. The spring nurtured them for many years, and a few thousand years, until very recently, actually, when one of those springs dried up. Uh, Again, what this story evokes is how people have been giving meaning to land, to water sources, to their collective sense of being, through these stories, through finding signs of, and if you go to any part, always water springs where water came from has profoundly detailed stories of origin, because that's where our sense of existence was dependent upon. That's how we made sense of how we will occupy a land or be in a land and then farm. So it in many ways evoke a very beautiful sense of shared meaning of land and water sources for communities all over. This I want to share from Northeast again, from Sikkim. Um, this region, beautiful region that you see on the screen is Zongu. It's a sacred territory for the Lepcha indigenous tribe that lives and acquire this landscape. It's a sacred landscape because the Lepchas believe that they are made of the fresh snow from the Kanchenjunga mountain, and that this is the land that they first came. And also subsequently, Guru Padma Sambhava said that the secret of the world is actually in five spots spread across this landscape. But what I want to share here is how stories are informing people's resistance. So also the river that you see flowing in this picture, Tista, is heavily dammed, and actually last year, Tista 3 hydropower project broke after a glacier. Well, it's scientifically in the newspaper report, it says glacier outburst, but it's really the melting of ice in our glaciers that resulted into this catastrophe that eventually led to the uh, dam being burst on October 4th, 2023. Um, what Lepchas have been actually saying is that their the river carries their stories of origin. So when you block and dam the river, you block their stories. Now I'll share what the story is. So Alyan Fawning, a female shaman called Mun in the Lepcha community, a very good friend of mine, she narrates the story of rivers Rangit and Rongyu. So from many glaciers of Kanchenjunga flows two rivers, one male Rangit and another female Rongyu. The dragon has been traveling with the female river ever since the start and carrying all stories along with her. Whereas the male has been accompanied by a white bird that you see on the screen, pheasant. So Rangit reaches earlier than Rongyu to the point where they have to meet. And Rangit gets very angry because Rongyu has not reached. Rongyu is taking all her time looking at beautiful birds and looking at the forest and is late. And so Rangit is very angry and turns back. And as Rangit is turning back, Rongyu says, Ti Setha, which is basically, when did you arrive? And that's how the name Tista came about. And because Rangit has turned around, it causes the great flood. So, in the narration of the Lepchas, the floods, the massive floods that happened in their origins and in their times happened because of this. Now, for them, these stories are very sacred. They hold their stories of emergence, and that's why their resistance and now their whole resistance towards the dams in this region is guided by these stories of the river and of their collective emergence and how both cannot be separated. Um, I think for many of you would know the story of Neoli, the great barbet, and I think there are also many versions of these stories. But I found this very interesting actually, and I discovered it when I was in Munsiari last year, and I was talking to some folks locally, and then I was looking up about this, and because if you are in Munsiari, you would hear, I'm sure Ram can tell, you would hear Barbet's mournful call, this pew, 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 quite often, okay? And it's just constantly there. And one local story goes that the bereaved parents, born as Barbet in subsequent lives, of a lost son named Shlok, were searching for their lost son, and they couldn't find it. So that's the mournful call that the barbet keeps calling. Now what I found profoundly beautiful in this is that birders really struggle with remembering calls. Not people like Ram, he is too good at it, but people like me really struggle with it. But when a story is attached to something like this, it becomes it becomes much more meaningful to really know these calls. And what does it mean to know more than human world through, this bit of an animation? Now one would say, why do we need these stories to, learn about calls? We can do it differently. Sure, we can, but I think this really adds the element of making the rest of nature relatable for us, and bringing a sense of aliveness to what's happening around us. Ancient texts and natural world deep observations have been so interconnected. We know this through so many stories that I'm sure many of us must have read growing up. This ancient stories of Jataka tales have this very beautiful story of the woodpecker, a good example of the two woodpecker friends. One of the birds was weak, the other was strong. The former wanted to share a hardwood tree in which the latter lived, and despite advice to the contrary, tried to peck a hole in it and died of exhaustion. And some scholars maintain that the description suggests that the weaker friend was the rufous woodpecker that you see on the left, and the stronger one is the golden flameback. And indeed, in the natural world, we know that the former usually occupies the nest of tree ants and only occasionally uses the tree holes. So it's also, many of these stories have, they're not just random stories, they have meaning, they have sense of deep observations of the natural world. They're based on paying attention to what's around us. Um, the other story that I want to share is about the black neck cranes. And again, uh, there are so many stories around cranes in general, all across India. Wherever they're found, there's so much connection that humans have created with cranes. But black neck cranes are these alpine species that are found in the higher altitudes of China, India, and Bhutan, and it's celebrated in various cultures. For example, in Arunachal Pradesh, it is believed that it is whenever they see a black neck crane, they believe that they embody the sixth Dalai Lama. And the man with a very literary bent, he once penned an eulogy for the bird when he cited it and compared it to the Buddha. And that poetic rendering kind of instilled in his followers a reverence for the bird as well. And if you ever see a black neck crane, you see it as Dalai Lama being reincarnated and visiting their ancestral land to bless them with the fortune. And in Ladakh too, it's a symbol of peace. And one of the most popular dances on mating is based on the black neck crane. So we know that embodying nature through dance, through kind of mimicking, has been part of traditions and cultures to really see, um, to 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 feel nature in our bodies, to feel nature in our senses, to have more sensory experience through calls, through body, through mind, through smells. And I think that has been a powerful way that humans have connected to nature, either through reverence, through embodiment, through of course stories. But that has helped get a sense of what it would be like, what it would be if a human was a crane. And so really, actually moving through these boundaries of separations. Of course, these are liminal spaces, so they have their boundaries. But it's about transcending those boundaries once in a way and finding that sense of connection, and sense of maybe those being in those liminal spaces when that boundary is very blurred. I want to share this story, which actually got tears in my eyes when I first heard it. And I think it was so powerful because of the way the world is changing and the way things are changing and the conflicts. We have this concept of human wildlife conflict, and that it's a reality that we live with every day. And this story is in that backdrop, but a very powerful and a very different version of it. So we were in Tosha Maidan in Badgam district in Kashmir, and they have a very fantastic effort that they led of actually um, getting this huge grassland back to the community and doing ecotourism kind of work. But that's another story. I won't get into that, but The imam there, who had been part of this whole process, was telling the story to us, and he was sharing that there was a leopard in the surrounding villages that was attacking the humans, and it had entered human territory, so to say, and eventually killed a very young boy who was survived by his grandmother. And she was very poor, she was left alone, and that really, enraged the villagers when they got to know that, the only grandson has been killed. And so they found the leopard and they tied him to a tree and decided to pelt stones at him until he dies, because they have to punish the wrongdoer, and the punishment in that part of the world is about, throwing stones at them. And so the grandmother of the child came to the leopard's rescue and told the villagers that what the leopard did was out of hunger, a desperate need, but what you are doing is out of vengeance. And so she stood in front of the tied leopard and said that you will have to first stone me to death, and only then you can go and kill the leopard. And villagers had to back off. Um, for me, this story, it still gives me goosebumps, but the story is really talking about how they have to be recreated each time we encounter difficulties, or our relationship with the more than human world gets complicated and entangled because of the kind of destructions. And that entanglement actually changes because of the kind of destructions that we are doing to their ecosystems, and what that sense of responsibility on us is in that sense. um, I've shared so many stories from India, so I wanted to go a little bit outside India and wanted to go to where else to go but to North America. No, I'm just joking. But in a sense, also share a bit of connection in that sense from the other parts of the world. So Turtle Islands, I'm sure many of you might know of it, also known as the North America, as we in the modern world know. The indigenous communities, the Potawatomi community in the North America believes that they call it the Turtle Islands, and they tell the origin story of the Turtle Islands, in which a sky woman fell through a hole in the sky made by the fallen tree of life, and was saved by the geese and the other animals that fell with her. So, in the other picture that you see, it kind of explains that story. They brought her mud and earth from below the vast ocean that they planted on the back of the turtle. The muskrat gave his life to get Sky Woman earth from below the water for planting. Authors who have worked on this said that the gratitude and reciprocity of humans and creatures form the world as in the Turtle Island. From the branch in her hand, the tree of life, she seeded that land in all the seeds of all the plants. And so we know that the world was created not by one alone, which is in the mainstream of the articulation, but rather in the beginning of the world, the species were our life raft. And now, in the spirit of reciprocity, we must be there too. And that this is the way we answer the question, what does the earth ask of us in return for the gift this world on turtle's back? What is that we give in return? It's a beautiful story of how we were created, or we of how other species enabled the creation of communities that actually eventually lived in North America, or the Turtle Islands. And so now, what is our responsibility back to those species? Because the time in where that responsibility is shared is also expanded in many of the articulation of indigenous communities. The other one that I want to share with you is from New Zealand, Wanganui River. And in 2017, the Wanganui River and her adjoining ecosystem was granted rights as that of a living person by the government um, of New Zealand through an act called the Tiviawatupa Act, which recognizes the river as a living person and also her adjoining ecosystem. Now, that whole process was informed by 150 years of struggle against colonialism and etc. by the Iwi indigenous community, the Iwi Maori community living there. And the Wanganui River ecosystem, uh, the community believes that we are the river and the river is us. So that separation between the river and them doesn't exist. And they have a beautiful story of how the river came about. So when the great mountains of Tongariro and Taranaki came into conflict over the love of a beautiful mountain, Pihanga, a battle was started. And so the Tongariro eventually won this fierce battle, and Taranaki was wild with grief and anger at the loss of his love, ripped himself from the ground, and tore a path through the country to the setting sun. Soon after the mighty battle, a stream of river water sprang from Tongariro, which is the other mountain, and filled and healed the wound Taranaki had made in his flight towards the ocean. Green forest, filled with songs of birds, grew throughout the valley of this river, known as the Wanganui River. So that's how the legend talks about the Wanganui River. And I think that beautifully captures what people had been arguing for. And so if you see in the story sounds like any other human story of, love and battle and whatnot. But in many ways, that's how people have made sense of that ecosystem, of that space, where that separation between what that ecosystem is and you doesn't exist. And so you protect, you stand for that river and for that ecosystem. And so when these people went to the government, they asked for complete elimination of all the violations that were happening to the river, which includes damming, deforestation, and other such things. And the Crown, which is the New Zealand government, apologized for all the destruction that they have done to the river and reversing some of those damages that are done to the river. Now, what these stories, I think I've spoken a lot, and so I'll now move towards the end of this conversation, and I would like to hear stories from all of you. I'm sure you all have. But what essentially why these stories are important, what they're talking about. Now, even most of these stories that I shared with you today, and there are tons, I couldn't share all of them. There's so many more. There's a renewed sense of connection with rest of nature. So you see nature and yourself as a part of a whole. And so that figure on the right is what many of these stories are talking about. But what is it in clash with, or in response to, or in many ways in conjunction to, is this dominant story, a dominant story of ego, of man, not even a woman actually, on the top of the pyramid, and for whom the rest of nature is made, for whom this abstraction is, and he can decide when that abstraction has to happen, and it's for serving them. So and that's why storytelling is important, because there is a dominant story. It's all a question of story. So we are in trouble now with all the destruction and biodiversity loss we are facing, is that we don't have a good story. And primarily we do have many stories actually, but we're not visibilizing those stories, we're not talking about those stories. Those stories are relegated to margins. um, and so there's a dominant story of homogenized humans. Everybody has to be the same. There's a competition, there's hierarchy, we exist in a sense of scale, and there's growth, and there's continued expansion, and there's extraction. So that's a dominant story, and that has been told across the world to everybody, that you must pass through those stages, you must pass through those ways of being, and then only you will be developed or whatnot, or progressed, or considered a valuable human being. Whereas if you be like the Dimasas living in Assam, or be like the indigenous people living in North America or New Zealand or Latin America, you have not yet reached the point where you have to reach. So in many ways, they are telling about how we the old story, the dominant story, has been actually hijacking many of these stories, and actually this dominant story is not really effective. If it was effective, then the kind of crisis we are facing today we wouldn't have faced. And so we need to tell more stories, and that's where this whole idea about telling more stories and having more conversations of stories becomes so crucial, because we need to tell more stories of collective celebration of the world that we live in, Um, and why tell these stories is because many of these stories and all of these that I've shared with you, there are experiences, there are belief systems, there are dreams, there are fears, there are views about the world. So these are not just stories in isolation. They carry people's worldviews that help them make sense of the world, that actually designs or supports their resistance to so many crises that are facing today. It supports their views on what kind of politics they have. It supports their views on what kind of economy they organize. So they are really the essence of who they are and how they help them to stay connected and to actually talk about that there is no separation from the rest of nature. So there's a sense of collective emergence in all of these stories. They're also based on people's lived experience, so they carry a lot of traditional knowledge. In several of them, it's about deep observation of nature. In several of them, it is observation of the animal species, birds that live around them. It is about a different sort of an observation, not the ones that we are used to, but a different sort of way of making sense of the world that they live. And that traditional knowledge is the most crucial for them to be connected to their land and protect those lands and mountains and ecosystems that they live in. They're diverse, and all of these stories from different parts of the country and some that I shared from other parts of the world are very diverse. They have different sense making, but they also have commonalities. And the commonalities of interdependence, reciprocity, um, shared existence, all of that is very common to all of these stories. And I'm sure you might have found out other commonalities as well. They're in many ways guiding collective futures of what we do next. For example, people in the Lepcha tribe, when they go to the forest, they seek blessings of the forest to ask what should guide their next steps, how should they be in this world. So in many ways, they're guiding their collective futures also. Um, Questioning language and cognitive imperialism, and why I mentioned that, but particularly in our context, is that when we speak in a language that is not ours, and right now I'm speaking in a language that's not my mother tongue, um, and especially I think it is peculiar to English language, because most languages have that sense of animacy and that sense of the rest of I mean much more I think depth to them in terms of expressing relationships. We have to question how we've been trained in thinking about these things also. So in much of the modern language, and especially in English, all of rest of nature becomes it, and it doesn't really have any sense of a sense of personification or sense of reverence that usually a lot of these worldviews have had. So our language imperialism and cognitive imperialism has kind of taken away that sense of connection from the rest of nature. And the last is that in all of these stories, rest of nature is alive. It's not something that just exists somewhere outside there that can be extracted, appropriated, and whatever destroyed. It has that sense of rest of nature alive. But most importantly, that aliveness is guiding people's sense of that we need to protect it, that we need to do something about it, that we need to conserve it, and they have been doing it, and also fighting the fights and the battles that are needed to protect them further. The Lepcha story, the Wanganui story are all examples of that. So this is my last slide, and then I'll stop, which is to say that what does it mean for all of us to think about our sense of place in this world right now, and it is finding what is that sense of connection to wherever we are living, and that rootedness and that radical attention that we need to pay to things around us, to more than human beings around us. And I think this fantastic effort by India's nature is one step towards that. That during monsoon, so many things surface around us, and are we paying attention to it? Are we sharing with each other? Because that actually then evokes a sense of the entangled empathy and our responsibility in protecting those landscapes. Until and unless we know what's around us, how will we stand up for them and how will we protect them? And also stand with those communities and people wherever they are struggling to protect these landscapes, and really supporting. How can we actually support the lepchas when they are saying that we don't want any more dams in our rivers, because that stops our stories of collective emergence. And within ourselves also, how do we resist this mechanistic and utilitarian way of looking at rest of nature and questioning our own ways of relating with nature in many ways. And that's where I think storytelling works as an important way of decolonizing ourselves and the way we have been kind of trained, because it can act as a powerful tool. But what stories we tell, who tells, and how do we tell, and who all come in those stories, it becomes even more important. But mostly what it is trying to articulate is, or at least what I'm trying to articulate, is that there are so many ways of being in this world. That's what these stories are trying to tell, that there are many, many ways, diverse ways of knowing and being, which are based on us interacting with the more than human and the rest of nature. And that how can we celebrate those many ways of being and ways of doing things, rather than being stuck in one of the dominant ways that we usually find ourselves being stuck in. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you for your patient listening, and I look forward to hearing more from all of you of what you think about these stories, and also maybe share stories from your side.